Imagine this. You are standing in the shadows of the Sistine Chapel on a humid Roman night in 1503. The flickering candlelight dances across marble walls as screams echo from the papal apartments above. Your hands tremble as you clutch a letter bearing the papal seal, knowing that what you've witnessed tonight will shake the very foundations of Christianity. The man who claims to speak for God on earth has just finished hosting what he calls a religious ceremony, but the sounds you heard through those heavy oak doors had nothing to do with prayer. You are Cardinal Giovanni Burchard, keeper of papal ceremonies, and your journal records horrors that make modern scandals look like children's games. The man sleeping in the papal bedchamber isn't just morally corrupt, he's systematically turned the Vatican into his personal pleasure palace, where sacred rituals have been replaced by orgies, where young women and men disappear into papal apartments never to emerge unchanged, where the spiritual leader of millions treats human beings like disposable entertainment for his twisted appetites. What you don't know yet is that this same man has been poisoning his enemies while bedding their wives, selling church positions to fund his debauchery, and turning the holy sacraments into tools for sexual blackmail. His name is Rodrigo Borgia, but history knows him as Pope Alexander VI, and what he's done to the papacy makes every other Vatican scandal pale in absolute comparison. Think medieval popes were all about spiritual devotion and holy contemplation? Think again. You're about to discover that the most powerful religious position on earth was occupied by a man so depraved, so systematically corrupt, that his own cardinals whispered he had made a literal pact with the devil. What he accomplished in 11 years of papal rule contains more systematic evil than most dictators manage in entire lifetimes. The horror you're about to witness began long before Alexander VI ever wore the papal tiara. Born Rodrigo de Borgia in 1431 in Valencia, Spain, he learned early that the Church offered unlimited opportunities for those willing to abandon every moral principle. His uncle, Pope Calixtus III, had already established the Borgia family tradition of treating the papacy like a personal business empire. But Rodrigo would take family corruption to levels that defied human comprehension. By age 25, Rodrigo had purchased his way into the College of Cardinals through a combination of family connections, strategic bribes, and the kind of sexual blackmail that would define his entire career. But here's what makes his rise truly terrifying. He wasn't hiding his depravity during his climb to power. Cardinals, bishops, and papal officials all knew exactly what kind of monster they were enabling, and they supported him anyway because he made them rich and provided them with access to pleasures they could never obtain elsewhere. The papal court of the late 1400s had already become a cesspool of corruption, but it took a special kind of evil to shock Romans who had grown accustomed to clerical misconduct. Rodrigo Borgia possessed that special darkness. Even before becoming pope, he maintained multiple mistresses simultaneously, fathered children with married women, and used his position to coerce sexual favors from the wives and daughters of men seeking church positions. What distinguished Rodrigo from typical corrupt clergy was his systematic approach to evil. He didn't simply break his vows of celibacy. He weaponized sexuality as a tool of political control. Every seduction served a purpose. Every illegitimate child became a political asset. Every sexual scandal involving his enemies was carefully orchestrated to destroy their influence while strengthening his own position within the church hierarchy. The transformation that occurred when Cardinal Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492 reveals how absolute power doesn't corrupt gradually. It unleashes monsters who have been waiting for the opportunity to reveal their true nature. Within weeks of his coronation, the papal apartments had been renovated to accommodate activities that would have scandalized pagan Rome. Secret passages connected his private chambers to receiving rooms where he entertained guests in ways that violated every principle of Christian morality. Contemporary accounts from palace servants describe scenes that sound like they belong in the deepest circles of Dante's Inferno rather than the center of Christian authority. The new pope immediately established what he called sacred celebrations, elaborate dinner parties that began with religious ceremony and devolved into organized debauchery involving multiple participants, both willing and coerced. These weren't occasional lapses in judgment. They were regularly scheduled events that required extensive planning and preparation. What makes Alexander VI's reign particularly disturbing is how he corrupted the sacred rituals of Christianity to serve his personal appetites. Confession became a tool for gathering sexual information about penitents that he could exploit later. Private audiences with the Pope often involved demands for sexual favors in exchange for church positions or papal favors. He transformed the process of granting indulgences into a system where forgiveness could be purchased not just with gold, but with the bodies of petitioners' family members. The Pope's private apartments became legendary throughout Europe for their decadent appointments. Rooms were specially designed with hidden viewing areas where Alexander could watch his guests before deciding how to use them for his entertainment. The furniture included pieces specifically crafted for activities that had no place in any Christian setting, let alone the papal residence. Artists were commissioned to create frescoes depicting explicit scenes that served as conversation starters for the Pope's more intimate gatherings. Giovanni Burchard's diary, discovered centuries later in Vatican archives, provides first-hand accounts of papal entertainments that shocked even Renaissance sensibilities. The Pope would invite prominent Roman families to dine at the Vatican, then systematically seduce or coerce their wives and daughters while the men were forced to watch or participate. These weren't spontaneous acts of passion. They were carefully choreographed displays of papal power designed to humiliate his guests while demonstrating his absolute authority over their most precious possessions. The systematic nature of Alexander VI's corruption extended far beyond his personal appetites. He established networks of brothels throughout Rome that operated under papal protection, with a percentage of profits flowing directly into Vatican coffers. These weren't clandestine operations. They were openly acknowledged businesses that advertised their papal connections as a selling point to potential clients. The Pope personally inspected these establishments, often selecting workers for private service in the Vatican. What truly set Alexander VI apart from other corrupt popes was his complete lack of shame about his activities. Previous papal scandals had involved attempts to hide or minimize misconduct, but Alexander celebrated his depravity openly. He hosted public festivals where sacred and profane elements were deliberately mixed to create spectacles that mocked traditional Christian values while satisfying his need for novelty and stimulation. The Banquet of Chestnuts in October 1501 stands as perhaps the most documented example of papal depravity in Christian history. Contemporary accounts describe an evening that began with a formal dinner for 50 courtesans and ended with organized activities involving the Pope, his children, and multiple participants in combinations that violated every conceivable morale. Boundary. What makes this event particularly significant is that it wasn't hidden or secret. It was attended by cardinals, foreign ambassadors, and prominent Roman citizens who were forced to witness the complete degradation of papal authority. But the Pope's sexual appetites were only part of a broader pattern of evil that encompassed murder, theft, and the systematic destruction of anyone who challenged his authority. Alexander VI didn't simply break his vows. He turned the papacy into a criminal organization that used religious authority to shield activities that would have horrified secular rulers. His victims weren't just those who participated in his debauchery. They included countless individuals who disappeared after threatening to expose his activities or refusing to provide what he demanded. The relationship between Pope Alexander VI and his daughter Lucrezia Borgia reveals depths of corruption that challenge modern understanding of familial boundaries. Historical documents suggest a connection between father and daughter that went far beyond normal parental affection, involving private meetings that served purposes unrelated to family business or church administration. Lucrezia's multiple marriages were arranged not for political alliance but to provide her father with access to new families and fresh victims for his manipulation. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's son, became his father's enforcer and accomplice in activities that combined sexual predation with political assassination. Together, they developed techniques for eliminating enemies that involved elaborate dinner parties where victims were simultaneously poisoned and sexually humiliated before dying. The father-son partnership in evil was so complete that contemporary observers struggled to determine which member of the family originated their most depraved innovations. Now that you've witnessed the systematic transformation of the papal court into a pleasure palace, you're beginning to see the patterns hidden in Christianity's darkest chapter. If uncovering these buried truths about religious corruption resonates with your curiosity about the real human experience behind institutional power, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most guarded secrets. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between authority and moral responsibility. The methods Alexander VI used to maintain his power while indulging his appetites reveal a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate religious authority for personal gain. He appointed cardinals based not on their spiritual qualifications, but on their willingness to participate in or ignore his activities. These men became complicit in papal crimes because their own positions depended on Alexander's continued favor, creating a system where exposure of papal corruption would destroy everyone involved. The Pope's control over church finances allowed him to fund increasingly elaborate entertainments while enriching his supporters through the sale of religious positions. Bishoprics, abbeys, and cardinalates were auctioned to the highest bidders, with prices adjusted based on the sexual favors or family members that prospective buyers were willing to provide as part of their payment. This wasn't simple simony, it was the complete commercialization of spiritual authority. Alexander VI's relationship with his mistresses reveals the calculated nature of his personal relationships. Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as the Pope's courtesan, wasn't simply a romantic partner, but a tool for gathering intelligence about prominent Roman families. Through Julia, the Pope learned intimate details about potential enemies and allies, information he used to expand his network of sexual blackmail and political control. The papal court during Alexander's reign operated like a sophisticated criminal organization with religious ceremony providing cover for activities that would have been prosecuted in any secular court. Visitors to the Vatican were carefully evaluated for their potential usefulness, either as participants in papal entertainments or as sources of wealth and influence that could be exploited through sexual coercion or other forms of manipulation. Foreign ambassadors who came to negotiate treaties or seek papal support found themselves in impossible situations where diplomatic success required either participating in activities that violated their personal morals or providing access to family members who could satisfy papal appetites. These diplomatic encounters weren't conducted in traditional meeting rooms but in private chambers where the Pope's demands became clear through demonstration rather than explicit negotiation. The transformation of religious festivals under Alexander VI shows how completely he corrupted traditional Christian observances. Easter celebrations became opportunities for elaborate orgies disguised as spiritual ceremonies. Christmas festivities involved gift exchanges where the presents included human beings provided for papal entertainment. These weren't additions to religious observance. They were replacements for traditional worship that maintained the appearance of piety while serving entirely different purposes. The Pope's use of confession as a tool for gathering sexual intelligence represents one of the most disturbing violations of religious trust in Christian history. Penitents who sought spiritual guidance found themselves subjected to invasive questioning about their intimate lives, information that was recorded and used later for blackmail purposes. The sacred sacrament of confession became an espionage system that fed papal appetites for both information and victims. Contemporary medical records suggest that Pope Alexander VI's sexual activities resulted in the spread of diseases throughout the papal court and beyond. The Pope's personal physicians treated conditions that were clearly related to his lifestyle choices, but their treatments were documented in coded language that disguised the true nature of the illnesses affecting Vatican residents. These medical records, discovered in monastery archives, provide evidence of health consequences that affected not just the Pope, but dozens of individuals connected to papal entertainments. The systematic recruitment of young people for papal service reveals the organized nature of Alexander VI's predatory behavior. Vatican staff included individuals whose primary qualifications were physical attractiveness and willingness to participate in activities that had nothing to do with traditional church service. These positions were openly acknowledged within the papal court, with different categories of servants assigned to different types of papal entertainment. What makes Alexander VI's reign particularly tragic is how his corruption affected genuine attempts at church reform. Cardinals and bishops who sought to address legitimate spiritual needs found their efforts undermined by papal activities that made mockery of Christian teaching. Reform movements were systematically destroyed not through theological debate, but through sexual scandals orchestrated by the Pope to eliminate potential critics. The financial records of Alexander VI's papacy show how church resources were systematically diverted to fund personal appetites and family enrichment. Sacred treasures accumulated over centuries of Christian devotion were sold or melted down to pay for papal entertainments. Donations intended for charitable works were redirected to support activities that violated every principle the donors thought they were supporting. The Pope's relationship with organized crime families in Rome and throughout Italy created a network of mutual protection that allowed both papal corruption and secular criminality to flourish without interference. Alexander VI provided religious sanction for criminal activities, while crime bosses supplied enforcement and recruitment services for papal needs. This cooperation between religious and criminal authority created a system of corruption that infected every level of Italian society. The impact of Alexander VI's reign on ordinary Christians throughout Europe was devastating. Believers who looked to the papacy for spiritual guidance instead witnessed systematic mockery of their faith by the man claiming to represent Christ on earth. Church attendance declined dramatically as reports of papal behavior spread, undermining the authority of local clergy who were associated with Vatican corruption despite their own moral conduct. The assassination methods favored by Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare combined their appetites for sexual dominance with their need to eliminate political enemies. Victims were invited to intimate dinners where they were simultaneously poisoned and sexually humiliated, creating deaths that served both practical and psychological purposes for the Borgia family. These murders weren't simple eliminations, but elaborate ceremonies that satisfied papal cravings for dominance and suffering. The papal apartments during Alexander's reign included specially constructed chambers designed for activities that required both privacy and the ability to dispose of evidence quickly. Hidden passages allowed for discreet transportation of participants, while specially designed furniture could be quickly rearranged to conceal the true purposes of rooms when unexpected visitors arrived. The architectural modifications made to the Vatican during this period reveal the systematic planning that went into papal crimes. The international implications of Alexander VI's corruption extended far beyond Rome, as foreign governments struggled to conduct diplomatic relations with a papal court that operated more like a criminal organization than a religious institution. Treaty negotiations became exercises in moral compromise as diplomats found themselves forced to choose between their nation's interests and their personal principles when dealing with papal demands for sexual tribute or family access. The documentation of Alexander VI's reign survived multiple attempts at Vatican censorship because his corruption was so extensive that complete concealment proved impossible. Church records, diplomatic correspondence, personal diaries, and financial documents all contain references to papal activities that early church historians tried to suppress or destroy. The survival of this evidence across centuries demonstrates the extraordinary scope of papal depravity during this period. The psychological impact on individuals who served in the papal court during Alexander's reign created lasting trauma that affected their descendants for generations. Families connected to Vatican service during this period developed reputations for moral compromise that influenced their social standing and marriage prospects long after Alexander's death. The social contamination spread beyond those directly involved to encompass entire networks of Roman society. The religious innovations introduced by Alexander VI corrupted traditional Christian practices in ways that influenced church ceremony for decades after his death. Sacred rituals were modified to include elements that served papal appetites rather than spiritual purposes. These changes became embedded in Vatican procedure and required extensive Reformation efforts by subsequent popes who struggled to restore traditional Christian observance. The Borgia family's approach to education reveals how corruption was systematically transmitted to the next generation. Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia received instruction not just in traditional subjects, but in techniques for sexual manipulation, political assassination, and financial exploitation. Their education prepared them to continue family traditions of evil rather than to serve any legitimate purpose within church or secular society. The network of informants established by Alexander VI created a surveillance system that monitored the private lives of prominent Romans for information that could be used for sexual blackmail or political control. This network included servants, clergy, merchants, and even family members who reported intimate details about their employers, congregations, customers, and relatives. The information gathered through this system fed papal appetites for both intelligence and victims. Pope Alexander VI's final years reveal how his appetite for evil continued to escalate even as his physical capacity declined. Age didn't diminish his corruption, but concentrated it into increasingly desperate attempts to satisfy cravings that had grown beyond any possibility of fulfillment. His last entertainments involved levels of depravity that shocked even those who had grown accustomed to papal corruption over the previous decade. The circumstances surrounding Alexander VI's death in August 1503 remain historically controversial, with evidence suggesting he may have been poisoned by enemies who finally organized effective resistance to his reign of terror. Alternative theories propose that he accidentally consumed poison intended for a dinner guest, a fitting end for a man who had used poisoned meals as weapons against his enemies. Whatever the cause, his death was celebrated throughout Rome by citizens who had lived in fear of papal corruption for over a decade. You came into this story thinking the medieval church represented spiritual authority and moral guidance, and now you leave understanding how completely religious power could be corrupted by an individual willing to abandon every principle of human decency. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey of discovery has awakened your appetite for truth about institutional corruption, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations that official histories won't teach. Your curiosity about the real human experience behind religious authority deserves to be fed. The legacy of Alexander VI's reign continued to influence church policy and Vatican procedure long after his death. Subsequent popes implemented extensive reforms designed to prevent future corruption on the scale achieved by the Borgia papacy. These reforms included new procedures for papal selection, restrictions on family involvement in church affairs, and oversight mechanisms intended to monitor papal behavior. However, the institutional damage caused by Alexander's reign created cynicism about religious authority that influenced European politics for centuries. The documentation of papal corruption during this period provided ammunition for Protestant reformers who used Alexander VI's reign as evidence of Catholic Church degradation. Martin Luther and other reform leaders cited specific examples of Borgia family corruption to justify their break from papal authority. The sexual and financial scandals of Alexander's reign became central arguments in theological debates that ultimately split European Christianity. The artistic and cultural legacy of Alexander VI's papacy reflects the complex relationship between patronage and corruption in Renaissance society. The Pope commissioned works from prominent artists including Pinturicchio and Michelangelo, but these commissions often served purposes related to his personal appetites rather than genuine artistic appreciation. Frescoes and sculptures created during his reign included subtle elements that referenced his sexual activities or served as conversation starters for his intimate entertainments. The social transformation of Rome during Alexander's reign reveals how institutional corruption affects entire communities. Roman families modified their behavior to protect their members from papal attention, avoiding social situations where they might encounter Vatican officials. Marriage patterns changed as families sought to shield their daughters from potential papal interest. Economic relationships shifted as merchants and craftsmen found their businesses either elevated or destroyed based on their connection to papal corruption. The international diplomatic crisis created by Alexander VI's reign forced European governments to develop new approaches to Vatican relations. Traditional protocols for papal diplomacy became impossible when dealing with a pope whose demands included sexual tribute and family access. Some governments recalled their ambassadors rather than subject their representatives to papal corruption, while others developed elaborate strategies for conducting necessary business while minimizing exposure to Vatican demands. The ecclesiastical reforms attempted by cardinals and bishops during Alexander's reign provide insight into how institutional corruption resists internal change. Reform efforts were systematically undermined through sexual scandals orchestrated by papal agents, financial pressure applied through church appointments, and physical threats directed against reform leaders. The failure of these internal reform attempts demonstrates how complete corruption at the top of an institution can paralyze all efforts at improvement. The financial cost of Alexander VI's reign extended far beyond the immediate expenses of papal entertainments to include long-term damage to church fundraising capability. Christian donors throughout Europe reduced their contributions when reports of papal corruption reached their communities. This financial crisis forced the Church to develop new revenue sources and contributed to practices like indulgence sales that further undermined church credibility. The medical and public health consequences of Alexander VI's activities affected Rome's population in ways that contemporary observers couldn't fully understand. The spread of diseases through papal networks created health problems throughout Roman society. The papal court became a center of contagion that affected not just direct participants but their families and associates. These health impacts persisted long after Alexander's death and influenced social patterns in Rome for decades. The psychological damage inflicted by Alexander VI's reign on church officials who maintained their personal integrity created lasting trauma within Catholic leadership. Cardinals and bishops who witnessed papal corruption while trying to maintain their own moral standards suffered conflicts that affected their ability to perform their religious duties. Some abandoned their positions entirely, while others developed elaborate psychological defenses that allowed them to continue functioning despite the environment of systematic evil surrounding them. The preservation of evidence documenting Alexander VI's corruption required the courage of individuals who risked their lives to maintain accurate records of papal activities. Vatican staff, foreign diplomats, and Roman citizens created hidden archives that preserved documentation of crimes that official church histories attempted to suppress. These secret records, discovered centuries later, provide the foundation for modern understanding of the true scope of Borgia family corruption. The impact of Alexander VI's reign on Christian theology created intellectual crises that influenced religious thought for generations. Theologians struggled to reconcile the doctrine of papal infallibility with the obvious moral bankruptcy of Alexander's leadership. These theological challenges contributed to intellectual movements that questioned institutional authority and emphasized individual spiritual experience over hierarchical religious structure. The story of Pope Alexander VI serves as a timeless reminder that institutional authority provides no protection against human evil when that authority lacks effective oversight and accountability. His reign demonstrates how quickly religious leadership can transform from spiritual guidance into predatory exploitation when individuals with unlimited power abandon moral restraint. The lessons from his papacy remain relevant for understanding how corruption develops and spreads within any powerful institution. The light of those Vatican candles still flickers over the papal apartments where Alexander VI once entertained his victims. But now we understand that those rooms contained not just individual depravity but the systematic corruption of spiritual authority on a scale that staggers human comprehension. The screams that echoed through those chambers represented not just personal suffering, but the death of religious credibility that took centuries to restore. In our modern world of institutional scandals and abuse of power, the reign of Alexander VI reminds us that evil doesn't require supernatural explanation. It simply needs opportunity and the absence of accountability. The most powerful religious position on earth became a platform for crimes that shocked even Renaissance sensibilities, proving that no institution is immune to corruption when authority is concentrated without effective oversight. The children who suffered in papal entertainments 500 years ago are long dead, but their experience resonates through history as a warning about the danger of unchecked power combined with moral abandonment. Alexander VI's reign stands as perhaps the clearest example in history of how religious authority can be completely perverted to serve evil purposes while maintaining the appearance of spiritual legitimacy. The transformation of the papacy from spiritual leadership to criminal organization under Alexander VI reveals the eternal tension between institutional power and moral responsibility. His legacy reminds us that vigilance against corruption must be constant, that accountability mechanisms must be robust, and that no leader, regardless of their claimed spiritual authority, should be exempt from moral scrutiny. The price of abandoning these principles was demonstrated in the papal apartments where the representative of Christ on earth became an embodiment of everything Christianity was supposed to oppose.